first be talking about the translation process that went into my translation of the Gathas, what I learned from it, lessons we can take from it, especially in our modern times. And also we discussing how there are many times, especially since it is my academic field and not just my faith as well, that academics get Zoroastrianism wrong. And I'll explain some of the ways in which that happens and how that sort of affects media perceptions of our faith as well. And also, I will be speaking about the sort of challenges and duties of a modern Mazdayasni nowadays. One thing that I definitely find out every time I meet with my fellow youth is how confused they are about how to be a good Zoroastrian in the world. And so I'll give a little bit of advice from my own studies and also for my own reflections on the faith. So a little bit about me. I was born in Panama in Central America. My mother is Panamanian, my father is Puerto Rican. And I now live in Texas. My bio says that I'm a scholar, an author, a theologian, a translator, a game writer, podcast host, lecturer, and a proud member of the Revived Zoroastrian Center of Austin. In Austin, Texas, we're trying to form a stronger community there, inspired by the work you all have done here, actually. I'm currently working on a second graduate degree in multi-religious theology. My first degree was a Master's of the Arts in Religions of Asia and Africa from SOAS at the University of London. While there, I affiliated with the Shapurji Pulamji Institute of Zoroastrian Studies, where I learned Zoroastrian history, theology, and the Avestan language. From this, I was able to complete, and through Mantra Books, my publisher, be able to publish a new and acclaimed translation of the Old Avestan text called The Sacred Gathas of Zarathushtra and the Old Avestan Canon, thankfully available for purchase in most major bookstores. I'll also have some copies here to sign and sell if you'd like any after the talk. On the horizon, my next major projects are a full theological commentary, theological and philosophical commentary on the Old Avestan texts, and an exploration of Zoroastrian metaphysics. I'm very overjoyed to be back here at the California Zoroastrian Center, where I actually had my Sedra Pushi in July 2018 back there. On a very, very hot summer day, so I'm glad to have returned when it's a little bit cooler. So thank you for having me. To begin, I want to talk about Avestan as a language and the Avesta as a book. So the Avestan language is Proto-Iranic language. It is the source language for anything that we consider to be an Iranic language. The most fascinating aspect of all is for anyone who's sort of a linguistics nerd, it has very little taken from Indo-European and Proto-Indo-European language structures. Very few of it remains in Avestan, which means it was very localized when Avestan was first being formed. And when we're talking about the first area where Avestan was being formed, composed, spoken, is sort of the Central Asian area, sort of North Iran, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan sort of areas. From there, Avestan, at around the time of Zarathustra, most scholars nowadays, and I do as well, date it to be anywhere between 3000 BCE to possibly 1500 BCE. I know that's a long time frame, but once we get past a certain point of history, it becomes far more difficult to pinpoint exactly when someone is from. But one of the most interesting things about Avestan, as no doubt you're all aware, is that it can actually be divided into actually 3 separate sub-dialects of Avestan. What I translated was Old Avestan. Old Avestan is the oldest form of Avestan. It was the Avestan used by Zarathustra to compose the Gathas, by the first Zoroastrian community to compose the Yasna Haptangaiti, and by Zarathustra, very likely, to compose the 4 sacred prayers or mantras that we tend to say. After that comes Young Avestan, or New Avestan, as some scholars call it. Young Avestan is mostly what the rest of the Avesta as a book is composed of. We're talking about the Yasna, the Old Avesta, with the Yash and the Gaz and everything. There are some also Pahlavi, Middle Persian influences that come into there, mostly because all these texts were written after the first Zoroastrian community. And we're talking not just a few decades after, but centuries, way many centuries after. The Yasna is probably believed to have been composed probably 300 or 400 years after Zarathushtra. The Old Avesta probably around that time as well. The Visperad a little bit later, so about 500, 600 years. But the youngest of all texts, and this is how we're able to tell because the language of the Avesta began to, how should we say, get broken, degrade. It was no longer in common use. People didn't really speak it or write it much. And so by the time the youngest of the Young Avestan texts were written, basically the language was beginning to be less and less understood. By the time the Vendida was written in the early Sasanian period, the language was basically almost not spoken, not written normally. And commentaries were done in sort of an early form of Middle Persian or in what was the common language of the time, which is Aramaic. And so the Vendidad itself is made up not even of what we would consider Young Avestan, but of a more broken Young Avestan. It's meant less to be a composition of someone that was alive during the time of the Avestan language being spoken, and more of a composition of someone who is trying to copy the way it was written and the way it was spoken. So that's how we know that the Vendidad is the youngest of all the texts in the Avesta, and why some major Zoroastrian theologians tend to actually reject the Vendidad as a part of the Avesta. Certain texts, of course, depending on the community, sometimes the individual, of course, are chosen to be more sacred than others. But the main reason why I chose to translate Old Avestan is because that is directly the language that Zarathustra had the most interaction with, and that we know that the Gathas were directly composed by one person, Zarathustra, and we know this academically too, because the language structure within the Gathas shows us that it was the composition of one person. Basically, the best way it was put to me by an Avestan lecturer of mine is it has too many mistakes and self-doubting to not have been the composition of just one man. And that's an interesting clue in seeing how we know that it was written by one person. When it comes to translating, especially what I did when translating the Old Avestan text, in particular the Gathas, is it was one of those things that I didn't want to mess up. And I had this idea of turning it into a very long-term project. It would take me maybe a decade or more to work on it. At SOAS, I took a course under Almutinse to learn Avestan, and I also contacted, not just for that class, but I also contacted other great Avestan scholars in the United States, Canada, Europe, and India to try to learn further on the Avestan. I also was able to get in contact with a couple of Avestan scholars in Iran, which were able also to teach me further and unlock further understandings. But I also wanted to cross-reference with all the other translations of the Gathas. One of the most interesting things to me is we are one of the few religious communities that has so many translations on what is a very small book available to us in English. Translations of the Gathas in other languages that aren't, say, ethnically native to most Zoroastrians, so say like Farsi or Gujarati or what have you, So, for example, translations in French, German, Spanish, and so forth, they're very, very limited. But in English, we have over 25 translations released only in the past 150 years, which is a lot. To make a comparison, there have only been 7 major translations of the Bible in 500 years. So it shows, one, we're unsure on how to deal with Avestan because it's still a very complicated and complex language. And we also want to try to share our understanding and knowledge with each other, because a lot of translations of the Gathas are made as devotional acts by people who have acquired the knowledge to be able to translate the Gathas. And so they're done for us, the Zoroastrian community, and usually are not done for the greater public or academics to inform them as well. So what I tried to do is I read every single one of these translations, and with my knowledge in Avestan, and also a little bit of knowledge in Sanskrit to help bridge the gaps here and there, I was able to figure out what words people were using and why in different translations, common mistakes that happen in the Gathas. So one of the more common mistakes is in the early 1900s, late 1800s, there was very much this attempt at free-form translation. Free-form translation, one of the classic examples that's used in philology, the study of languages, is the translation of the Sufi poet Rumi. His translations are consistently free-form in English, because in that time period is when they were translated. Free-form means that it's mostly poetic, it's not literal. There is very little actual, how should we say, substance in the translation according to it being as accurate as possible to what was actually written. So there was this Islamic scholar that I talked to who said that if you put a translation of Rumi in, like in English, he's talking about roses and flowers and love and everything, and then the actual Arabic reads something along the lines of like, one must love and submit to Allah. And so it's a very drastic translation, just because the poets at the time were also the translators of text. And you can't really trust the poet to translate a text accurately, to be honest. But it does take a poetic mind to translate the Gathas. And that's one thing I definitely learned, because the other end of the spectrum, besides free-form translation, is exceedingly dry academic literalist translation. The problem is that, especially with Avestan, where one word in Avestan can mean 5 to 6 different things sometimes, depending on the context, depending on how it's used, and so forth. The Avestan language, when translated non-poetically, sort of loses substance, actually. So I tried to also see poetic structures of the Indo-Iranian time period, of Iranic history from as far back as possible. Read a lot of translations of the Shahnameh and Ferdowsi, and of course tried to see what other scholars had to say about the poetic structure of the Gathas. And one of the things is, it's hard to translate into English the song aspect of it, because the way that mantravans, these sort of like traveling clerical singers, I mean, this tradition still exists in the Iranian world today of people who just travel and sing about holy things, about new philosophies, or even old poems. And so Zarathushtra was in Mantravan, and that existed in that time, and that's the main way that language was actually, and any sort of knowledge was spread in the time period. We don't get a written version of the Gathas until far, far later, probably late Achaemenid period. And that's a guess, because we don't have physical versions of it anymore, but we do have writings of people who say that they saw a physical version of, say, the Gathas or the Avesta and so forth, way back in the day. But by going through all these different translations, I wanted a middle ground. I wanted to be able to express the poetic quality while also to put it frankly, not lying to anyone who reads it by making sure that the words that are used are as literal as possible, but fit in the context. I also wanted to avoid something that scholars had done way too often, which is a lot of the sentences referring to Ahura Mazda are actually fairly genderless in Avestan. And so this created a mistake, especially when French and Spanish and German authors tried to translate it, because they tend to have more gendered language structures. So you start seeing a lot of Ahura Mazda being described with sort of strong physical and also sort of male linguistic qualities. But when you read the original Avestan, that actually does not exist. Instead, what's mentioned is sort of how should I say, a less physical, a more metaphysical Ahura Mazda that is less something you can touch and more of like something you understand. And that became more fascinating, and also began to see that translations of, for example, good and evil, which we're so used to in seeing in a lot of Gothic translations, good and evil are very much sort of words that were used according to the sort of ethical and moral mindset of a lot of the translators of, say, the late 1800s in particular, which is, and this applies sadly to some of our greatest scholars and translators, like Dastur Dalla and the like, who translated the Gathas based on an understanding from the Protestant spirituality department of Columbia University. Which in particular places a more moralistic Christian emphasis on its translations. And so that happened also in the way that good and evil came as a discussion in our faith. By studying the philosophies and religious structures and theologies of the time, not just of Zoroastrianism, but also of nearby faiths, one is able to see that what ancient Zoroastrians, and probably in the time of Zarathushtra and the first Zoroastrian community as well, what they treasured were virtue against unvirtuousness. Now that's more, how should we say, flexible than a little bit of a good and evil term. Virtue becomes very situational. You know, one of the classic arguments that's used in sort of study of ethics is, you know, how would one feel if you saw someone stealing a loaf of bread? Does that situation and that feeling change if they're doing it because they have no other way to feed their family? And so what that question does is a question that in the Gathas, Zarathustra poses such questions, not just to the reader, but to Ahura Mazda as well, to try to figure out what sort of mindset we should have about these sort of questions. And the mindset that's proposed by Zarathustra, at least from what I see in the translation, is one of a combination of two things: thought. Thought first and foremost. One must think through each one of our own thoughts. We must analyze, reflect, and meditate on our own thoughts. When we speak, we must think about how we speak, on why we speak, what we're speaking of. And when we commit actions, we must think on how those actions affect others, how they affect ourselves, and so forth. And also how the grand culmination of all of these actions, words, and thoughts of not just ourselves, but our communities, our nations of the world, affect the very reality in which we live. And so the best way to answer a question of, you know, the stolen bread paradox is instead to help create a world in which no one will have to steal any bread. And that's what Zarathustra basically proposes, a world of sort of ethical thinking and of sort of driven and passionate people who want to live lives of virtue and free will and free thought, who place an emphasis on critical thinking and analysis as well. One of the things also is a deep reverence, a natural spirituality that shows up throughout the Gathas and the Yasna Haptangaiti. there is a veneration. I use veneration and worship interchangeably because Zarathustra did as well. And in Avestan, the same word, yasna, and any of its derivatives, basically can mean veneration, adoration, worship, love, and embracingness. So it can mean different things depending on the context. But there's a love and adoration and definitely worship of, say, our natural environments, of our love for the trees, our love for the waters, our love for the air, our love for fire and the like, because there is a sort of understanding of the whole holistic aspect of existence, that without not just one another, but of the greater whole of creation, we are left sort of abandoned. And as such, that is impossible because of the way that all of existence exists, interconnected in this sort of way. And that's a message I feel that sometimes is lost in other translations as well. It shows up in some translations, some of the better translations, which are sadly, this is another issue that our community has. A lot of the better translations of some Zoroastrian works are hidden behind major paywalls in academia, or they are in books that are accessible only to wealthy academics of about $200 or more sometimes. So it was my goal to grab that wisdom and, make it available for as inexpensive as possible. But one of the things we also see is the use of terms like salvation, of adherence, of submission. These are terms that came into our understanding of Avestan through both Christian and Islamic interpretation of our texts. It happens that over time, the waters get muddled, and some of even our most brilliant minds became sort of attached to these sort of translations. Modern academics, especially non-Zoroastrian academics themselves, have noticed that these are not correct words to use. More fitting would be things like adoration, support, friendship, connection, binding, and also one of the most important terms that shows up frequently actually translates to something closer like enlightenment. Less as in, say, the enlightenment of a Buddhist, but more as in our mind, the darkness of our mind is then brought to light, and the darkness is cleared. And so we are given new knowledge, thus we become enlightened. We see things a new way, we become enlightened to this new knowledge, to these new ways. And Zarathushtra basically pushes a message of ashavic enlightenment, of by meditating, by aligning to asha in our daily lives, we are able to basically live healthier, both mentally and physically, and also to have productive, happy, caring, and solidified lives where we realize sort of the interconnectedness of our existence. So yes, and I've found most of that work particularly fascinating. As I said, it was supposed to be decades or more, but you find silver linings anywhere you can. And so when I was stuck at home, thanks to the pandemic quarantine, I realized that I had months on hand with no other work. I'd recently just returned from London, and so a project that I thought would not be released until way far down in my academic future became attainable within those few months, in which I dedicated basically almost 8 to 10 hours a day working on this translation. And I was glad to have finished it. So discussing sort of what I've noticed due to my translation, and if you want to read more about it in the book, I have a translator's notes section in which I talk about why certain words were chosen, and a glossary as well. I also wanted to talk about sort of the issues and techniques I've noticed when it comes to teaching Zoroastrianism or talking to Zoroastrianism, whether it be to your own children, sometimes, for my own family who are not as familiar as well, to the media, which I've had to do before, and also to classes, academic institutions, your coworkers, and so forth. So one of the main issues I've noticed is a lot of what we base Zoroastrianism on, even within our own community of adherents, is we tend to go to three avenues. One, are sort of elders of our community, which is totally fine. I mean, they have a lot of wisdom and knowledge that they can bring to us that academics sometimes miss out on because they pay too close attention to the books or to the carvings on the hillsides and don't speak to, say, like an old lady in Yazd who may know, something that other scholars did not find out about. Mary Boyce was very adamant about this as well, about speaking to the common Zoroastrian to be able to understand the Zoroastrian faith. Two, they tend to take it from the internet. And as we all know, the internet is not full of wisdom and good thoughts, good words, good deeds. But it is full sometimes of misinformation. And so even places say like that we would consider to be trustworthy, like say checking a news source page on what Zoroastrianism is, to be able to send it to a friend and not have to type out 3 or 4 pages about what the faith is, or say checking out Wikipedia. These sources tend to be more wrong than correct most of the time. Wikipedia itself is consistently prone to ideological combat in its editing. So you may find different factions of Zoroastrians consistently editing the page. There was one day where I refreshed almost every 5 minutes and something new had come up to change something else. So be careful when it comes to that. And sometimes we tend to go to YouTube or to books and literature and everything like that. And again, same issue, use your critical mind, try to figure out what best to find. But also, we are a community that is severely misunderstood. Very few people know about us. When I was being taught in public school about Zoroastrianism, it was about 3 minutes. And it was a discussion about how it was the faith of ancient Persia, and there were no more Zoroastrians left in the world. And as you see, well, I mean, we're still here, so very incorrect. But that's what's being taught in American public schools, at least when I was coming up. So imagine my surprise when I actually ran across some Zoroastrians. So one of the things I have to say is, especially with, no doubt, many of you have kids or grandchildren and whatnot who are in school right now, check what they're learning about sometimes their own faith, because that can imprint on them and thus can confuse them even further. When I worked on this translation, I also consulted with the North American Mohammed's Council because I wanted the theological opinion, not just from academics or your average Zoroastrian and everything. I wanted to hear sort of what the clergy thought. But what was interesting is, besides them liking it, thankfully, there was also a discussion about how it's rare to find a good Zoroastrian book. They're particularly very rare. A lot of them are made almost as vanity projects, whether they're good or bad. A vanity project doesn't mean necessarily that it's for selfish reasons. It's just that that's the term used in publishing to say it's not like a major published work. It's usually sort of like self-publishing, or someone who even writes it down on a piece of paper and like hands it to someone. I've seen different sorts of these. Some have been spectacular scholarship, and some are the most out there conspiracy theory nonsense that you could ever see about the faith. And I'm sure all of us have encountered both sides of this sort of Zoroastrian literature. But yes, I would just advocate be careful. The books I most recommend to people is the most accessible work I recommend to anyone is Zoroastrianism: An Introduction by Dr. Jenny Rose, which is fantastic. I hand it to all my non-Zoroastrian friends, and they come out of it knowing a good amount. which is very good, very nice. And I also recommend, if you're wanting to dig into sort of the academic discussions that are happening around Zoroastrianism, there's the Wiley-Blackwell Companion of Zoroastrianism. I think it's anywhere between $50 to $100. Again, academic texts tend to be this expensive, but it's also very thick. And so I recommend it as particular to Zoroastrian so you can see what academia is talking about us, about, you know, what do they care to study about us, and how can we influence what they study as well. Because they talk about interactions with Zoroastrians and how that kind of affects what they also want to study. And also, I, of course, recommend my translation, not to be selfish myself, but I hope it is very enlightening to people and whatnot. But one of the things going back to like teaching Zoroastrianism is every time I've led a course, I've done lectures, courses around the world and online on Zoroastrianism, and one of the things I've always noticed is even you know, a born and bred, raised in the faith, you know, Zoroastrian, will not be able to grasp sometimes simple concepts about the faith. This is because sometimes they receive conflicting ideas. When you have a community of free thinkers, you tend to have more opinions than set solid facts about things. My common joke is if you have a room of 10 Zoroastrians and you ask them what the core of the faith is, you'll come out with 12 answers. And so I think that's one of the qualities of our faith also as well. We're a very discursive faith. We're a very dialectic faith. We try to find answers in the in-between. Not just, see, a lot of faiths tend to have concepts of sola scriptura, which is Latin meaning for only the book. So, you know, there are some Christian faiths, for example, that, and even Islamic Quranist movements that believe you should only follow the holy text and everything in it, literally. There are others who believe that sola fide, sola scriptura, which means in Latin only the book, but also the faith, which means the traditions of their ancestors. Muslims in particular practice this way, and Catholics do as well, which is a combination of the book and also what was done by the first communities and the councils that came up from it. Zoroastrians are different. We're lying closer in this way to, say, our Jewish brethren in this regard. While we do have a heavy set of Zoroastrian texts that some communities or another may consider completely sacred, or may consider only the Old Avestan text sacred, or may consider only certain books of the Avesta sacred. All that aside, the two things that we can agree on is definitely that the Gathas are core to Zoroastrianism. I don't think anyone denies that. But also that it is through our discussions with scholars, our ancestors, even what they have taught us, our community right here, with priests, the average layperson. It is through that discussion that we're able to use our access to, say, Ashavahishta, and to all of our sort of good thoughts and our connections to each other to be able to find sort of the truth of the faith, our theological standing. It's sort of in the same way that I use the comparison with the Jewish community who uses the Torah and the Tanakh, their holy texts, to interrogate them, to not just follow them blindly, but to interrogate them to see how they apply, why they apply, what time period they were best for, if they're still great now. And we tend to do the same as Zoroastrians. We used to have a structure for this before the middle of the Sasanian era, called the Kastag. Kastag is an Avestan word, a little bit corrupted by early Persian, that sort of means school or thinking community. And Kastag, a Kastag basically would be where people would gather, priests, lay people, scholars, local nobles, merchants, soldiers, what have you. And they would basically present these questions to each other. They would say, but what do we believe in the afterlife? What do we believe about good thoughts? What is a good thought? What do we think about charity and so forth? And by the end of the day of their discussions, they would decide, we as a Kastag, as a community, believe in this thing. And the most fascinating aspect of this, and this is the beauty of our faith, one Kastag did not necessarily need to agree with the other to still be considered Zoroastrian. So one community could have, a certain belief. We believe the rains come from Tistria, or we believe, and then another community would have a belief that would say, but we believe that the rains are more of a natural effect, blessed by Tistria. Or we believe, another community would say, we believe that the rains are Tistria, and just a descriptor of it. And I'm basing that on actual sort of evidential notes that we have. There were communities arguing about that. But the thing is, under the eyes of the clergy or other writers of Zoroastrianism, this was all still Zoroastrianism. These were all Zoroastrians. And because they were blessed by Asha, they were able to have such critical thinking and fascinating thoughts and theologies of the faith. And no one was excluded out of that sort of thinking. We even have evidence of women taking part in these councils as equal spiritual members. The problem is that the Kastags were outlawed because one major Kastag probably took it a little bit too far. That was the Kastag of Mazdak. And so Mazdak's Kastag ended up growing to exponential levels, having influence in the imperial court, and then eventually it was outlawed and violently persecuted. And then all Kastags were made illegal. And after that, there was a decline in education and the strength of our faith until the Islamic invasion, which ended up shattering our knowledge centers in ancient Persia. And so what I advocate is a sort of revival. I want each center to sort of be more like a Kastag, discuss your theologies amongst each other. You don't have to be a scholar like me with a degree or two. Anyone, any Zoroastrian, has access to the same sort of knowledge, especially in the age of the internet and books and easy access to stuff. And not just that, but to each other. You're able to grow in knowledge, grow in a Shavic enlightenment, and be able to aid each other in the same sort of sense. And that's one of the sort of like duties, I would say, of a modern Zoroastrian, to get into the final section of my talk here. A modern Zoroastrian seeks knowledge. There's a line in here, Zarathushtra encourages everyone to seek knowledge wherever they may find it, to seek wisdom. And that makes us not just a faith of thinkers, but also a very open faith. We're able to go and seek knowledge wherever we may find it, like it says directly. If we were a literalist faith, then even for the better, it tells us right there, don't be literalist. Go and seek knowledge elsewhere as well. And I think that's what helps our community grow. We bring in, we have so many scholars in so many different fields, so many experts, so many grand, industrialists, thinkers, performers, scholars, and so forth. And they all come together and share knowledge with one another. You may not see it. You may just think that they're just, eating and drinking around a table or, at a center and whatnot, or playing with the kids outside. But even that sort of interaction allows us to share with each other something we may have learned and be able to increase each other's knowledge and understanding. So the duty of a Zoroastrian in the modern world, I would say, of a modern Mazdayasni, is to seek knowledge and share it. And also to be caring and charitable, to create a world in which the need for charity is impossible. To where we have, there's this great term I love in Avestan called frashokereti. Frashokereti is an Old Avestan term that speaks of the renewal to come. Zarathushtra speaks about that in the Gathas. Some have interpreted it to mean as the end of times. Some have interpreted it to mean as a continual renewal. The interpretation I would most take from it is that it is us working together, building a community that perfects, enlightens, and rebuilds the world and renews it until we continue further to the next step of renewal and the next step that brings us closer to, say, the eternal perfection of Ahura Mazda, what have you, to the greatest sum of our knowledge and experience, what some theologians have called sort of the omega point. And I think that we can be continuously active in that effort. For a small community, we pack quite a punch in world affairs. Name something happening in Iran, and immediately the news talks about Zoroastrians. In India, they are such a small community, and yet some of the greatest people in their nation are Zoroastrian. I joke that Zoroastrians are everywhere. We have Zoroastrians here in the United States, in great positions of business, in universities, in different sort of engineering fields, medical fields, and so forth. And we've even had Zoroastrians who have been caught for espionage. We've had Zoroastrians that have dealt in less savory aspects. But the thing is, that should teach us that there are Zoroastrians of all stripes. And our community has never been judged by our lesser elements. We've always been judged by how much we've given to the world. And I think it's wonderful that when people think of Zoroastrians, they think of a charitable and good and smart bunch. They may not know that much about us, but if they know that little bit, at least we're doing a good job. And so part of the major challenge is sort of maintaining that reputation while also increasing the knowledge in our, not just in the world, but also with ourselves, especially about our faith. Last time when I was at the World Congress in New York, one of the things I noticed hanging amongst my fellow youth is a lot of them didn't know much about the faith at all. I kept being asked questions continuously, and other scholars that were there also asked questions, even if they weren't Zoroastrian as well, just because there's a deep thirst for knowledge amongst the Zoroastrian youth about their faith. But part of this is because they've become experts in other fields. Their parents, their grandparents, what have you, have done a great job in encouraging them to become the best engineers possible, the best pilots, the best businessmen, what have you. But they feel that they've gained respect and wealth, but they've lost their souls, as one of them put it to me. And so that's one of the major challenges we have, making sure that they don't forget their faith, because especially for a lot of you here, it may not be my cultural background. It is my faith, but for a lot of you here, it is, and you lose aspects of culture when you lose faith like that. I've seen it in other communities, in my own research and studies, in my own travels. I love to travel, and I see it all the time. But what I definitely recommend is, even if they don't show or display interest, get your youth excited in the faith in some form or another. Give them books, find correct videos, have them talk to a scholar. What's funny is any academic, even a non-Zoroastrian academic, is happy to reply to emails you have about anything that they've written about, mostly because a lot of that work, like I said, is kept behind paywalls, and we wanted to access the greater public. So if they have questions, tell them to email an academic as well, or a priest, or what have you. But it is indeed becoming difficult, especially to teach elements of this old and ancient moral philosophy to a lot of modern folks. But we have an advantage. It is directly applicable to the modern world still, in many ways that other religions and philosophies are not. We look sometimes at other philosophies and religions and we think, wow, could they reinterpret that? Isn't that a little bit too outdated? But we look at Zoroastrianism, Zarathushtra in this form was a great genius in which he did think about these sort of things of what are things that are eternal to us, which is doing right, being virtuous, being honest, being industrious, being caring, being charitable. What are the great evils he lists? The evils that we still deal with now, the unvirtuous acts, as the literal translation would say. These would be tyranny, malice, greed, corruption. These sort of things are the things Zarathustra spoke against directly. And these are things that still trouble us to this day. So I think when we deal with the challenges within our community, I think we also should lead by example, by challenging those great and virtuous acts, so that our children, our family, our friends, our neighbors all see us as, direct and visible examples of our faith. In conclusion, I hope my thoughts have enlightened in some way any of you. I love talking about the faith. I got a degree in it, after all. And I absolutely love discussing it. And it's always a great opportunity to travel. And it's definitely my great honor to be back here where my faith journey began so many years ago now. It's weird to think about it that way, but I guess we lost a few years to the pandemic. But yes, I'm overjoyed, and if you'd like to get a copy of my book, let me know. I can now answer any questions you may have, or any comments, perhaps. All right, great. Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, yeah, yes.
Hi, Pablo. I am one of the PR members, Mitra Diniari, and I've seen your writings, and I am so glad that I got to meet you in person. What you say is what it is, and it brings me joy to see somebody from a totally different background to be matching what I think about this religion. I never call it a faith because in dictionaries, faith is illogical belief. I call this a way of life. So what you were saying about our background and, Zoroastrians, Persian Zoroastrians, the sad thing, I don't know if you know that, I'm sure you do because you're in academia. In Zoroastrian history, Gathas was never important. They mentioned it. I was born and raised Zoroastrian in Iran. We never, ever talk about Gathas. We knew there was Gathas, but when we went to the religious class to teach us stuff, we were just being taught Avesta, just recite Avesta, never the meaning of it. And this is in Iran, in my era, which is before the Islamic Republic. So there's been a lot of disservice done by Zoroastrians to Zoroastrians, never talk about the concept of the Gathas, and thank God we came to America, and now our focus is the Gathas, and I'm glad that you have a translation. Out of the 25, I hope yours is one of the ones that I will choose because I'm passing around the Gathas, the best ones that we have, the translations. So I appreciate your translation, the simple, because whatever you said made 100% sense to me, and the fact that it's the core of this religion. And the rest of it is icing on the cake. A few rituals, the traditions, those are very important, but not as important as understanding what this living religion is about. So I appreciate your talk, and thank you for the translation.
Thank you. To reply to that, thank you very much for all your kind words. It is, yes, very interesting to see continuously. So the reason why there was a time in our history as a religion where the Gathas weren't really spoken about or taught much is because many Zoroastrian priests who were tasked with sort of keeping the understandings alive and the sort of like critical understandings of these texts lost knowledge of Avestan and what it meant. We have so many records of Christian missionaries coming during the British times in India and even to Iran, poking fun at the fact that the priests didn't understand what they were saying, and that they could not find one priest who knew what the Christian missionaries called the babble of their tongues. And so that's embarrassing, to be honest. But clearly, the embarrassment led us to one of the biggest explosions of attempts to get Zoroastrians educated, both in Iran and in India. However, that sort of generational gap in knowledge was hard to break in so many ways. I have friends in Tehran and in Kerman right now who tell me that it is near impossible for them to really read and understand even the entire of the Avestan texts. Mostly because sometimes they'll be told by their parents or grandparents that it's just not necessary. Um, and I think that does a disservice. I mean, Zarathushtra, as I said earlier, tells us to seek knowledge wherever we may find it. And I think the easiest source to find is where Zarathushtra wrote it. And it's definitely my hope, especially with this translation, to get more people talking and thinking and acting out the principles of the Gathas. As you mentioned earlier, I think it's very important when people say things like, the criticizing of the term faith and praising of the way of life, because that sort of shows the sort of strength that we have as a faith. And I use faith in that particular regard because as a community is the better term. Because we can be different in our understandings of what we are, what we do, what we practice. But the thing that remains the same, and this is why it's important to understand the Gathas, is the Gathas and what's in them. They are the thing that binds us together, even if we may disagree on some of the other minute concepts, many of which were developed centuries upon centuries after the first Zoroastrian community, or are even fairly recent. Some of the concepts of, say, how we understand the Yazata or other forms of sort of cosmic structure of metaphysics and everything, that's very influenced by European theologians and philologists who had very little understanding of our faith, but because our ancestors, our spiritual ancestors at that time didn't either have a good understanding of the faith, they ended up believing what they were taught by these European philologists and theologians. And we're only just now breaking out of those sort of mindsets. And part of that was also, do not learn the Gathas. Why? Because a lot of these European theologians and philologists thought that it was meant for a select class, a specific group of people. When the Theosophists arrived in India, they taught this in particular, that these were holy and sacred texts. A lot of what we consider to be the traditionalist movement of India, with the staunch anti-conversion, anti-intermarriage, and so on and so forth, that actually is so recent because it comes from influence from Europeans and reaction to Europeans in the 1800s, in particular amongst theosophical missionaries that developed in the area of Bombay at the time. So yes, basically that's a long way of saying the Gathas are important, and I know that they help us understand the other aspects of our faith that may interest us, whether we want to view it as a way of life, as a faith, as a philosophy. One thing is for sure, that the teachings of the Gathas are eternal. Yes?
Hi, Pablo. Thank you. It was an enlightening talk. I really enjoyed listening to you.
Thank you.
Two quick questions. You mentioned there was, after Jenny Rose's introduction to Zoroastrianism, there was one academic book that you recommended.
Yes.
Can you say the name of it again?
Yes, the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Zoroastrianism.
Okay, thank you. And then the other question for you is that among the 25 translations you said that are out there, which one would you say is closest to yours?
Oh, well, that's very difficult to say. Let me see. There are, I would say, probably 3 translations that have gotten in any way as close to us. One's the original French translation, actually, that was done by so the first time that the Gathas were translated into a European language was into French. I think that was Dicaron, and then there is also a translation by Humbach. Humbach is a great modern translator and scholar of Zoroastrianism who mostly just concentrates on translating and studying Old Avestan. I corresponded with a few of his students as well in the translation process of this to try to understand why he chose certain words as well. But I would say that if there's any translation that I would say is the closest, most literal, the main issue with it, remember I was saying the importance of poetry in it, it lacks the poetry, but it is absolutely literal, word for word, literal translation of many aspects of the Old Avestan and the Gathas. There are some things that I would disagree with in the way it translates, but I would say that it's probably one of the best. The problem is that there are two versions of that translation. This is what I was talking about how sometimes ideologies come into play in Zoroastrian literature. There is the original Humbak translation, which is the one I recommend, and there is a Humbak translation with Palanikoporia, which has affected the translation to be more aligned to traditionalist Parsi beliefs. So I would say if you can find the one that does not include the sort of translation influence from Palanikoporia, but I would also still say Palanikoporia is a scholar, a great scholar of Zoroastrianism in his own way. It's just that even in the translator notes of that book, it's stated outright that it's meant to align more with the core beliefs and tenets of that movement. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you very much for coming, Pablo. I really appreciated your speech. I may have missed a little bit of the beginning, so I'm not sure if you addressed this or not. One, I would love to know what the spark was that got you interested and to study Zoroastrianism and obviously take it to the next level to become a scholar in it. And the other is what you mentioned about how Zoroastrianism is one of those things that if you're lucky and someone has some education, they'll say, oh, I've heard of that. And then they'll say, next sentence, oh, I didn't know there was any left. So how can we, in a simple way, I mean, this is also has been discussed over the years, just have this introduction in all the middle schools and high schools and obviously colleges, just a basic thing so that when people hear Zoroastrianism, they don't go into this mode of, what is that, what is that? And I think that would also help us all to feel more, we're not coming from, where people are not saying, what is it? And you have to explain the beginning of it. It's even a monotheistic religion, first religion, and all the qualities that obviously it has. But I'd love to know if you have any ideas on how to get a solid information out there.
Of course, of course. I'll start out actually with that question and then go back to my sort of my biographical background in Zoroastrianism. I always tell people that it's good to always develop a sort of elevator pitch. I know many of us have heard that term before of how to best explain Zoroastrianism to someone during, say, an elevator ride. And for a lot of people, that's difficult. Some of us, and I know some of my friends are this way within the community, it's you want to spend hours just going over the history and the nuances and the complexities because we're a rich, complex, and nuanced faith. But no one has 3 hours to listen to you sort of talk about the religion, unless, of course, you're here listening to me. But when it comes to, say, seeing sort of the good, quick, accurate description, what I tend to tell people is Zoroastrianism, one of the number one tools is avoid statements in sort of hyperbole. So even if it's accurate, telling people first religion, first monotheist faith, oldest continuously practiced faith, stuff like that. In a study that was recently done by the institute I was in, there's a sort of discussion of when people hear these sort of hyperbole statements, they tend to stop listening because they assume automatically, even if there's substance behind it, that it's made up because they're so used to a world in which other religions are consistently making up aspects of what their faith means, So the best thing to say is sort of neutral and also open in the way you discuss it. So instead of saying we believe or this is what Zoroastrians believe, what you should more be like, for example, this is how I would explain to someone. Let's say Zoroastrianism is an ancient faith, possibly more than 3,000 or 4,000 years old. It is a multifaceted, complex, theologically rich faith in which people are encouraged to use critical thinking, to adore the world and the existence that we live in, and also to give back to it as much as possible. And so that gets across the message without making sort of, statements, or also without making sort of assumptions of how our fellow Zoroastrians believe. Because these are sort of things that we all hold core in common. And it's easy to say that because they're in the Gathas. And when we just mention things from the Gathas in the way we tell others about our faith, no other Zoroastrian can really disagree that much. That's why it's important to try to have an accurate translation, because with 20 plus translations, you're going to get conflicting ideas and conflicting opinions. And the conflicting opinions are fine. It's what we think to be concrete in these words. We need to sort of generally agree on them. And I say generally because we're never going to have an exact agreement on anything. If you tried to tell this entire room of people how to exactly believe in Zoroastrianism, I bet about 80 to 90% of you would leave. But the beauty is that we're not a faith that does that. And yeah. I'll sort of break it down instead of repeating it exactly, so you sort of know how to tell people. Start by saying an approximate idea of how old the religion is. Already, by not making the claim of world's oldest religion, you can already imply that by saying something like we are over 3,000 to 5,000 years old. And it doesn't matter, because as long as it's below 6,000 years old, the very likelihood that you're accurate is high, You should also mention that we are a complex, multi-layered, and sort of nuanced faith. This way, or you can use the term way of life as well, what have you. This way you can let people know that there's more to learn, that whatever you say isn't the end-all, be-all. You could also, after that, state basically some of our basic principles, that we are a charitable, industrious community. We are discursive faith. You can insert anything here. That's why I'm inserting different examples now. That we are discursive and dialectical, that we seek to keep an open mind and search for knowledge wherever we find it, that we want to create a world in which charity is unnecessary by giving as much as possible of ourselves, things like that. By inserting these sort of broader concepts of the faith, you're able to let people know what it is we stand for. Because some people may believe Ahura Mazda is, a strong God force out there. Others may believe Ahura Mazda is an enlightened mind. And others may believe that Ahura Mazda is a spirit that runs through us. But the thing is, people have believed, and I say those three things because it may seem like modern ideas of Ahura Mazda, but these were ideas that were being debated in the Sasanian period and in the Parthian period. And so they were considered to be all applicable ideas of viewing Ahura Mazda. So it's best to stay away from making a theological statement and more of the values and the ethics we hold. Because if people are interested, they'll go ahead and they'll do the research, and hopefully you'll recommend them one of the books I stated. But yes, I would say that's a good short way of getting people to have a more accurate idea about the faith. Of course. Oh, yes. So in 2016, I went to the Parliament of the World's Religions, which is an interfaith event, the largest in the world. Back then, I was jobless, lazy, mid-20s, a lost youth of sorts, I guess. Spent my time mostly, hanging out with friends, what have you. I had dropped out of college, But one of the interests that had always stayed in my mind was religion and studying philosophy and stuff like that. So I decided, well, I'll try to go to to this event, and thankfully they had a scholarship for people like me, interestingly enough. And I was walking around this area that they have called the sort of like, I call it a spiritual marketplace. It's like booths where different religions and religious organizations have, and Fezana had one. And I imagine my surprise, having been raised on the idea that all Zoroastrians were dead, and suddenly seeing a Zoroastrian organization filled with like 20 people at this booth talking loudly, and some yelling at each other, And I was just like, well, I've got to figure out more. I got to learn more. And so I sort of hung around the booth. I asked some questions. I believe it was the Revetnas were the first Zoroastrians I ever met, and they gave me copies of books. Half of them I paid for, the other were just free because they wanted me to learn. And I went home after the conference and I was like, oh, well, that was cool, meeting some Zoroastrians. And I read these books and I began falling in love, basically. The faith seemed like everything I already had believed. I had long been a spiritual seeker, and I think it's good to always be a spiritual seeker. I think Zarathushtra would like that. But I had not found anything that felt so much like home than the teachings of the Gathas and Zarathustra. I read everything I could. I bothered everyone I could. I talked to God, so many people. Talked to the inimitable Dr. Irani, who used to be a colleague of Einstein's, and I remember he told me that I was a fascinating but annoying young man, and because I just kept sending all these questions, because one of the first Zoroastrian videos I saw was an interview with him about Zoroastrian philosophy. And we ended up having some great conversations before he passed, and he encouraged me always to keep an open mind and to not let anyone stop me in coming into the faith. And I also spoke even to the late Dr. Jafari, who is very lovely. There are even, someone is truly a lovely person even when you disagree with them, you just want to keep talking with them more. And that's how I felt with Dr. Jafari as well. And of course, I emailed scholars, priests, etc., all different ranges of responses. My entire process to my Seder Pushi in 2018 was, on one hand, a very welcoming and happy to have me sort of community. And on the other hand, I went through a period of my Zoroastrian life where I had sent death threats to me and my family. From sort of traditionalist, very hardcore Parsis, and also had folks that basically had tried to accuse me of every crime under the sun, had sent SWAT teams to my house, and had done a variety of other things, including calling my university and basically pretending to be rich Zoroastrians in the community, threatening that they would pull their funding. Thankfully, my university is smarter than that, but yes, and I had their support throughout the situation, but it got on both ranges. Thankfully, they don't bother me anymore. I think there is a truth about the Zoroastrian community that once you're in it for better or for worse. And definitely one of the things is that once I began to be more accepted in the community, attending the conferences, speaking at Zoroastrian centers, even to use modern terms, even my haters stopped hating, basically. And it was lovely because one of them even emailed me to apologize and said that they had read my work and they had realized what honesty I wanted to come into the faith with, which honestly, having a former enemy become your friend is one of the greatest compliments you can have, for sure. But that all led to July 2018 because I messaged various centers in early 2018, trying to find somewhere to have my Seder Pushi. So many just did not reply. Some said things like, come back in 10 years when things have changed. And it was the California Zoroastrian Center that was just like, no worries. And they communicated me with Mobet Dabu, and we talked. We set things in order, And I came here July 2018 with my partner and me, and the only people there were me, my partner, Mobed Dabu, and I think the secretary of the time, who was here. It was lovely being in front of that fire and felt finally, becoming a Zoroastrian in that sense, a part of the community. And ever since then, thank you. Ever since then, I went to go get my degree in Zoroastrian studies and have tried to give back as much as possible to this lovely community. Any more questions, or? All right. If you do have any more questions, I'll be hanging around. Of course. Thank you, and may you all be blessed.